Hello there. This is the story of a little girl named Ellie, living in a small town where dreams often feel too big for the struggles of everyday life. But sometimes, with a little persistence and a warm enough heart, something magical can begin even in the smallest of places. Where are you listening to this story from? What city are you in? Leave a comment below and let me know. I'd love to hear voices from all around. The house on Maple Hollow Road was barely more than a cottage, its white paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and the screen door always leaned on its last hinge. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soap and onions, the scent of late dinners and early mornings. Ellie lived there with her mother, Sarah, in a rhythm of quiet routines and tightened belts. Mornings meant toast with just butter, no jam, unless Sarah managed a good tip from one of her cleaning jobs. Ellie's winter coat was 2 years too small, and her shoes bore the imprint of last year's snow. But she never complained. Not out loud, anyway. Every afternoon after school, Ellie slipped out the back door, careful not to make a creak. She wandered down to the edge of town where the old rail yard had become a favorite haunt for stray dogs and bored kids. That's where she first saw them. 2 German shepherds bounding behind a chain-link fence, all muscle and grace, their ears alert like soldiers on watch. She didn't pet them, not yet. She just watched. Crouched behind a crate, her fingers wrapped around the silver whistle that once belonged to her father. It was the only thing she wore around her neck besides her mother's warnings. The whistle, the tattered photo of him kneeling beside a German shepherd, and a weathered notebook filled with scribbled commands. That was all she had left of David Brooks, her father. He trained K9 dogs for the county sheriff's department before everything changed. Before the silence came. Sometimes, if she closed her eyes just right, she could hear his voice again, gentle but firm, guiding her hands as they taught an old dog a new trick together in the backyard. She missed him. Not in loud ways, but in the kind that carved itself into a girl's bones. One evening, as the wind curled through the cracked window panes and Sarah scraped together a dinner of rice and frozen peas, Ellie spoke. "Mama," she said, her voice barely louder than the ticking clock on the wall. "If I could save up, really save, could we get a German shepherd? Just one. It doesn't have to be a puppy." Sarah didn't look up from the pan. "Ellie," she sighed, drawing out the name like a slow exhale. "We can't afford another mouth to feed, let alone a big dog with a bigger appetite. But I'd take care of it. I'd feed it and train it. We barely have enough for ourselves, sweetheart." Sarah turned then, her eyes soft but firm. "I know you miss your dad. I do too. But we live in the real world now. Dreams don't put food on the table." Ellie didn't argue. She just nodded, even as something inside her folded in like a paper bird crushed in a closed fist. Later that night, when Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV humming low, Ellie took out the notebook. Her father's handwriting still smelled faintly of leather and pine, as if the man himself had just stepped out of the room. She copied the commands onto scraps of paper and lined them up on the floor. Sit, stay, down, heel. Then she stood in front of the empty living room and practiced calling them out. Her hand raised in precise motions, her voice low and sure. She imagined a shepherd's eyes locked onto hers, loyal and sharp. She pictured the weight of its body at her side, the warmth of its fur, the way it would tilt its head just slightly when she said its name. At the library, she borrowed every book she could find about German shepherds, their intelligence, their bravery, their stubborn streaks. If the old computers weren't taken, she'd watch training videos, writing notes in the margins of her father's notebook. Ellie trained with the air, with shadows, with a pillow propped up on a chair. She trained like belief alone could bring the dog into being. And somehow, in the spaces where her longing lived, it almost did. The morning after Sarah's refusal, Ellie opened a mason jar and dropped in 3 crumpled dollar bills she'd saved from last year's birthday. She wrote for dog on the lid with a black marker and placed it under her bed, next to the worn sneakers she wore nearly every day. From that moment on, Ellie began to chase her dream in coins and calluses. She knocked on Mr. Harrow's door to offer lawn sweeping, even though the frost hadn't yet left the ground. She helped old Mrs. Langley carry groceries, which earned her 2 quarters and a soft peppermint. When the local grocer needed flyers handed out, Ellie volunteered, fingers red from the cold, voice hoarse from polite greetings. On Saturdays, she collected empty soda cans, stuffing them into plastic bags she hid behind the shed. Her jeans grew thinner at the knees, and her palms bore tiny cuts from bottle caps and brambles. Still, she never complained. Every night, she emptied her pockets, a dollar bill here, a few nickels there, all dropped with reverence into the jar. Sometimes, she'd stare at the collection under the moonlight slanting through her window and whisper, almost, but almost felt so far away. One afternoon, after scrubbing mud off a neighbor's porch for an hour, Ellie counted the change in her hand. 75 cents. Her fingers closed around it tightly, like maybe squeezing it would turn it into more. She walked home in silence, throat tight, eyes stinging in the cold wind. That night, she didn't practice commands. She just sat at the edge of her bed, her father's notebook open on her lap, tracing the inked lines of his careful penmanship. Patience is part of training, he had written once, underlined twice. Ellie pressed her palm to the page, breathing in its quiet strength. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not ever. It came on a Thursday, cold and brittle, when the sky hung low like it had secrets to keep. Ellie was riding her bike past the old feed store at the edge of town on her way to Mrs. Langley's for another round of sweeping leaves that refused to stay put. Her shoelace was untied, and the wind was biting her cheeks pink when she heard the sound. Not loud, not desperate, just a soft, hoarse whine from behind the dumpster. She braked hard, heart-catching in her chest. There, curled in the shadow between rusted barrels and broken crates, was a dog. Big, rough-coated, lean in that way hunger makes a body narrow. Its ears twitched when she stepped closer, but it didn't move, not away, not toward. Just watched her with eyes the color of amber dirt, tired and old and waiting. A German shepherd. Ellie dropped to her knees without thinking, gravel biting through the denim of her jeans. She didn't reach out right away, just sat, breathing in the scent of wet fur and rust, speaking in the low, careful tone her father once used when calming a nervous pup. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I promise." The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just laid its head back down, one paw tucked beneath its chest like it had once been trained to obey and was still waiting for a command that never came. Ellie didn't make it to Mrs. Langley's that day. Instead, she stayed beside the dog until dusk painted the alley in shadows. She ran home for a blanket, half a sandwich, and a trembling hope she didn't dare name. Her mother scolded her for being late, but the words slid off her like rain on tin. Her mind was already curled in the dark beside that creature. That night, she opened her father's notebook again. Between pages on recall commands and leash etiquette, she wrote in shaky pencil, "I think I found him. Not bought, not bred, but maybe meant." The next morning, Ellie returned before the sun had cleared the trees. The shepherd was still there, curled into himself like a secret. He lifted his head when he saw her, but didn't move, his tail giving one uncertain thump against the gravel. She named him quietly, like offering a gift. "Scout," she said, crouching low, holding out the leftover crusts of toast she'd hidden in her coat pocket. Like in To Kill a Mockingbird. Brave and clever. Took 3 days before he let her touch him. 5 before he followed her, limping slightly, as she led him through back alleys and across vacant lots toward home. She didn't take him inside. Not yet. She knew better. Instead, she made a little shelter behind the shed with an old comforter and a bowl of water. She washed his wound with warm salt water and dabbed it dry with the last of her father's gauze rolls. Each night, she sat beside him, reading out loud from the dog training book like it was gospel and he was her only congregation. When her mother finally saw Scout, really saw him, it was a Sunday afternoon. Sarah stood at the back door, arms crossed tight, the screen swinging shut behind her. "Ellie," she said, voice flat, already tired. "What is this?" Ellie swallowed. "He's a stray. I think he's been out there a while. He's not dangerous, Mom. He's just scared." "We can't take in a dog," Sarah said, stepping off the porch. "Especially not one that size. Do you know how much a vet costs? What if he's sick? Or worse?" "I'll pay for it," Ellie blurted. "Or try. I have money from the bottles and the yard work, and I'll get more jobs. I made a chart. A schedule. I'll walk him every morning before school. Every day after. I'll feed him, clean up after him, everything." Her voice cracked, but she kept going, pulling a crumpled paper from her pocket. It was smudged with dirt and hope. a budget scribbled in pencil, a meal plan for a 50-pound dog, a list of local vets with the cheapest rates. I need this, she said, quieter now. I don't need new clothes or a phone or anything else. Just this. Her mother didn't answer right away. Scout watched them both from the corner of the shed, his amber eyes wary. For a long time, Sarah just stared not at the dog, but at her daughter, as if seeing her not as a child, but something in between. Something on the verge. Finally, she sighed. Not a yes, but not a no. 2 weeks, she said. He stays outside. You miss one chore, he's gone. You understand? Ellie nodded, trying not to cry, not from sadness but from the wild, impossible relief that bloomed in her chest like spring after a long, gray winter. Yes, she whispered. I understand. Scout didn't take to routine easily. He flinched at sudden sounds. The clang of a trash lid, the hiss of a passing bus, and once, when Ellie reached too quickly to brush burrs from his fur, he ducked away and growled, low and warning, as if memory itself had fangs. But Ellie didn't retreat. She crouched down, palms open. It's okay, she whispered. I'm not them. I promise. She remembered what her father used to say, kneeling beside her when they'd watched the police dogs train downtown. You don't break a dog to make it listen. You earn it. Trust isn't given. It's grown. So she started small. Sit. Stay. Come. She used quiet repetition, her tone calm and even, like a lullaby spoken instead of sung. Some days Scout responded. Other days he'd turn away, burying his nose in his paws like a child refusing to look. There were setbacks, the night he chewed through the garden hose, the morning he barked at the mailman until the man jumped back 2 full steps. Sarah had given her a look that said, one more thing. Still, Ellie persisted. She read more, took notes, practiced hand signals with the kind of focus her teachers always wished she'd give math. She cut old jeans into tug toys, stuffed peanut butter into hollow bones, and filled their backyard sessions with praise like currency. And slowly Scout changed. He began to watch her, not with suspicion but curiosity. He'd nudge her knee when she sat reading, rest his head on her shoes like they were his tether to something solid. One morning, after a long walk through mist-wrapped fields, he rolled onto his back in the dew-slick grass, belly exposed, tail thumping, and Ellie laughed, the sound rising light and amazed into the new spring sky. That night, she showed him the old training whistle her father once gave her. She held it gently, reverently before slipping it on a string around her neck. Let's do this right, she told Scout. And in his quiet way, the dog looked up at her as if to say, I already chose you. Scout began barking at night, low, guttural warnings that rattled the pickets of the fence and woke old Mr. Miller, who lived 2 doors down and had very little patience left for anything not wrapped in silence. He's too big for a house like this, Mr. Miller said one morning, arms crossed, gaze fixed on Scout like the dog was a bomb waiting to go off. Next time he growls, I'm calling someone. Sarah apologized. Ellie clenched her fists in her pockets, heat crawling up her neck. Shame wrapped in fury. But she didn't answer. Not yet. Then came the vet bill. More than $100 after Scout's limp turned out to be a strained tendon. Sarah stared at the receipt in stunned silence, lips pressed so tight they disappeared. Ellie, she said that night, voice tired as the sky. We can't keep this up. Food, the shots, the registration, it's too much. Ellie nodded, but her throat ached. That night, after Scout fell asleep curled beside her on the floor, she dug out the mason jar labeled Dog Fund and poured the coins into her palm, counting twice, then again, even though she already knew they wouldn't be enough. At school, her friends didn't understand either. You got a German Shepherd? Kevin sneered. Aren't those, like, police dogs? What, is he gonna arrest us? Even Lisa, who used to sit with her at lunch, had raised her brows. Isn't that kind of a lot of responsibility? For someone like you. Someone like her. The words stuck. But she kept going, walking dogs for neighbors after school, skipping snacks to save $1 here and there. Scout waited patiently every afternoon, tail thumping when she turned the corner. He seemed to know which days had gone badly. He wouldn't bark, wouldn't nudge, just sit beside her, pressing his warm body into her side like a shield against the world. Sarah watched them more, quiet at first. Then one evening, Ellie caught her smiling faintly as Scout nudged open the screen door just enough to rest his chin on Ellie's knee. You're really doing it. her mother murmured. I didn't think you'd last a week. I have to, Ellie said, and Scout lifted his eyes as if to echo the truth of it. A week after Scout's limp healed, Mr. Miller knocked on the door holding a dented tin bowl filled with leftover roast and carrots. Heard your mutt barking at that raccoon last night. Good dog. He muttered, eyes on the ground like he regretted the compliment already. Don't tell the others, but mine used to bark just the same. Big old shepherd named Duke. Ellie blinked, unsure what surprised her more, the food or the memory. Thank you, she said softly. Mr. Miller cleared his throat. You'll want to mix that with kibble. Too much fat otherwise. Got a couple old leashes in the shed if you need 'em. He walked away before she could say anything else, but the door between them wasn't quite closed anymore. Later that week, at the rescue shelter, Ellie lingered near the gate longer than usual. The woman in the green vest, Mara, her tag said, finally asked, You training him yourself? Ellie nodded, brushing Scout's fur where it stood up along his spine. Well, that's no small feat, Mara said, stepping closer. Especially if he's got baggage. A lot of shepherds do. They're smart. Too smart sometimes. She handed Ellie a wrinkled booklet from a shelf by the counter. This helped me with my first rescue. Might not be the same dog, but some things don't change, trust. Boundaries, patience. That night, Ellie sat at the kitchen table copying notes into a spiral notebook. Sarah passed by on her way to fold laundry, then paused, her hand hovering above a mismatched sock. What's that, she asked. Training schedule, Ellie said, not looking up. And feeding chart. And vet reminders. I made a budget, too. A silence settled in. Then Sarah sighed, pulled out the chair across from her, and reached for the pen. You're giving him fish oil? Where'd you read that? Ellie glanced up. Dad's notes. Page 12. Sarah stared at her for a long second. Then, quietly, he used to swear by that. The next morning, Sarah tossed Scout a slice of apple from her breakfast plate. Not too many, she warned like it was already routine. Scout caught it midair, tail sweeping the floor. For the first time in a long while, breakfast felt almost like home. The town's harvest fair came each October, with pumpkin pies, hayrides, and a pet talent show sponsored by the Rotary Club. Ellie had passed by the faded sign every year, never thinking she'd be more than a spectator. But this time she read the flyer twice. Scout could do this, she whispered, rubbing the dog's ears as he lay beside her feet, snoring softly after a long walk. He twitched as if agreeing in his sleep. She told her mother over dinner, nervous. It's not a pageant, Ellie added quickly. It's just a chance to show what he can do, what we've worked on. Sarah didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. The fairgrounds buzzed that Saturday with the smell of kettle corn and sawdust. Scout trotted beside Ellie, lean and sharp-eyed, his coat brushed to a sheen. People glanced, some admiring, others wary. One boy muttered, That's one of those dogs. Mean ones. Ellie swallowed hard but walked on. They waited under the red and white striped tent as golden retrievers rolled over and chihuahuas danced on hind legs. When it was their turn, Ellie stepped into the ring like it was something holy. She kept her voice calm and firm. Scout, sit down, stay. And he did. Perfectly. Then the trick they'd practiced for weeks, weaving through cones, circling back, pausing at her hand signal. Not flashy, but clean. Focused. Precise. A few claps scattered, then silence, until Mr. Miller, leaning on the fence, gave a sharp whistle. Well, I'll be. That dog's got manners. Ellie smiled, heart pounding. But it wasn't over. That night, as they walked home under a soft spill of starlight, Scout stiffened. A rustle, then barking sharp, frantic. From the McKinley house. Smoke, faint but growing. Ellie didn't hesitate. Go, Scout. He bounded toward the fence, barking until lights flicked on inside. The neighbors rushed out. The fire was small, a forgotten candle, but it could have been worse. Could have been so much worse. By morning, the story was everywhere. Shepherd alerts family to fire. The headline was crooked on the town's bulletin board. Ellie saw it as she passed, Scout by her side. Someone had scribbled a note in blue ink across the corner. Good dog. And under that, in smaller letters, Good girl. The fire had earned Scout respect, and Ellie a kind of quiet reverence. But the upcoming demonstration at the county's Fall Animal Expo was different. It was official. Judges. Scores. An audience that didn't know her or the hours she'd spent in frozen dawns whispering commands in breath-fogged air. This wasn't about saving the day. This was about proving who they were to others but mostly to themselves. On the morning of the event, Scout paced in the barn where participants waited, his nails clicking on the concrete, tail flicking with unease. Ellie kneeled and looked him in the eye. "We've got this, Scout," she whispered. "No matter what." The arena was larger than she imagined. A circle of bleachers and floodlights, the kind that made people squint and dogs wary. The judge called their number. She stood, legs stiff, heart thudding like it might break loose. They began well. A simple heel command. Scout stayed close, alert, graceful in his stride. Then sit, down, stay, the holy trinity of obedience. He nailed each one. Until the tunnel. It was the last obstacle. A canvas chute, long and dark. Scout paused at the mouth years back. Somewhere in his past, before her tunnels meant fear. Ellie knelt again, not calling this time, not commanding. Just waiting. She didn't rush, didn't push. She laid her hand on the dirt and whispered, "It's okay. I'm here. Always." Scout looked at her, really looked, then lowered his body and crawled into the tunnel, vanishing like breath into mist. For a moment, nothing. Then a tail. Then his whole body, shooting out the other side in a blur of limbs and pride. The applause started slowly, but it grew, rising like a tide. Ellie stood frozen, tears threatening, Scout panting beside her. His eyes bright with the kind of trust that doesn't come from treats or leashes, the kind born of shared fears and of walking through them side by side. They hadn't just completed a course. They crossed a bridge, one built from loss, longing, and a stubborn, beautiful kind of love. After the tunnel, after the applause, everything blurred, like waking from a dream where you could still feel the weight of it on your skin. Ellie didn't remember walking off the field, or how Scout's tail never stopped wagging, brushing her leg like a heartbeat. What she did remember was the look in her mother's eyes. Sarah had stood at the edge of the ring, arms folded tight, as if holding herself back from something she wasn't ready to feel. But when Scout emerged from that dark canvas mouth, when Ellie stood there trembling but whole, something in Sarah cracked. Not loudly, but enough. Later, as ribbons were passed and hands shaken, Ellie turned to find Mr. Miller waiting with a brown paper bag. "For Scout," he said, gruff as ever. "It's just some leftover roast and biscuits. Nothing fancy." But his eyes didn't match his voice. They were softer than she'd ever seen. "Didn't think he had it in him," he added. "Didn't think you did either." Ellie smiled, small and sure. "I get that a lot." Back at home, while Scout devoured the roast like it was a crown, Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, watching. She held something behind her back, an old photo Ellie hadn't seen in years, her father in uniform, with a younger Ellie perched on one shoulder and a young German shepherd on the other side, tongue lolling, eyes bright. "He would have been proud," Sarah said, her voice like wine through wheat, low, honest, full of things left unsaid. Ellie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Sometimes recognition wasn't loud. It wasn't trophies or checks. Sometimes it was roast in a paper bag, a photograph from a drawer, or a mother letting go just a little so her daughter could rise. And that, Ellie thought, might just be worth more than anything. The days that followed weren't easier, not in the ways people usually mean. The roof still leaked when it rained too hard. The grocery list was still written with more hope than money. Sarah still worked long shifts, and Ellie still counted change like it mattered, because it did. But the house itself had changed. There was Scout now, sprawled under the kitchen table, nose twitching at breakfast smells, tail thudding against worn linoleum with steady loyalty. He greeted Sarah at the door like she'd been gone for years instead of hours, and each night he curled beside Ellie's bed like a sentry who'd never sleep on the job. Sarah no longer called him that dog. She called him Scout, sometimes with a chuckle, sometimes with the kind of softness Ellie hadn't heard in her voice since before Dad died. Once, after Scout barked at the neighbor's cat, and then sat like a perfect gentleman when Ellie whispered a single word, Sarah shook her head and said, "He really listens to you." Ellie only nodded. But inside, something bloomed. The town, too, seemed to shift. Mr. Miller waved now. A kid from school who'd once laughed at her patched jeans asked if she could help train his dog. Even the librarian had set aside a stack of dog training books for her next adventure. They weren't famous. They weren't rich. But when Ellie walked down Main Street with Scout at her side, people smiled. They saw a girl who didn't give up and a dog who'd learned how to trust again. And maybe Ellie thought that was all they'd ever wanted, not just a place to live, but a place to belong. And now they had that. A little home, a little hope, and each other. One chilly morning, while rummaging through the hall closet for a flashlight, Ellie found it, an old tin box, rusted around the corners, tucked behind a pile of frayed towels and forgotten shoes. Inside were things she'd seen before and things she hadn't. The silver whistle her father used to wear around his neck, now dulled with time. A faded photograph of him crouching beside a big German shepherd, both of them looking toward something just outside the frame. And beneath it all, a weathered notebook, edges curled, her father's handwriting slanted and strong. She sat on the floor, Scout resting his chin on her knee, and turned the pages. Notes about behavior, sketches of training sequences, little observations. Always reward calm before command. Trust is earned, not expected. The best handler listens more than they speak. In the margins, he'd scribbled thoughts that felt less like instructions and more like a kind of quiet philosophy. A good dog doesn't just learn obedience. He teaches you who you are when you think no one's looking. Ellie ran her fingers over the ink, her throat tightening. This wasn't just her journey, it never had been. In every click of the homemade training clicker she'd cobbled together, in every whisper of encouragement she gave Scout, her father had been there. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as something living inside her, his belief in kindness, his patience, his way of seeing dogs not as tools but as companions, as mirrors. She shared the notebook with her mom that evening. Sarah traced the pages slowly, quietly, a hand to her mouth. Then she looked at Ellie and said, "He'd be proud of you." Ellie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Scout nudged her hand and she smiled, feeling the weight of the past and the hope of the future folded neatly together in that small, sacred space between them. She wasn't just training a dog anymore. She was continuing something bigger, something beautiful. Spring crept into the valley, slow and steady, with soft rains and the smell of thawed earth. Ellie spent her afternoons not just with Scout now, but sometimes with Mrs. Leary's nervous terrier, or helping Tommy Johnson teach his clumsy retriever to heel without tugging. People had started to notice, not just the dog, but the girl who moved with quiet purpose, who knelt and whispered and waited, who didn't force but invited. There were still hard days. Money stayed tight. Scout had his quirks and old fears, and Ellie had to remind herself, sometimes, that progress didn't mean perfection. But there was laughter in the house now, the kind that came from little things, Scout's goofy bark when he caught a stick midair, her mother's tired chuckle when he snuck scraps from under the table. They had more to carry, yes, but somehow the weight was lighter. On weekends, Ellie read more of her father's notes, adding her own beside them in a different, younger hand. She'd begun dreaming, not just of dogs, but of what came next. Maybe one day she could work with animals for real. Maybe she could build something lasting, the way her father once had. That evening, as the sun slid low behind the hills, Ellie clipped Scout's leash to his collar, though he no longer really needed it, and they headed down the gravel road behind their house. The sky was flushed in tones of peach and copper. Fields stretched out quiet and endless. Scout walked close beside her, his steps in rhythm with hers, his ears flicking at every bird call and breeze. Their shadows trailed behind them, long and sure. Ellie didn't know everything that lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of what the future might bring. She had Scout, she had her father's quiet wisdom, and most of all, she had found her own strength, patient and steady, growing with every step. Together, they walked on,